Steve wants to talk today a little bit about morality. I wanted to say a few things because about both morality and wait for meaning this afternoon. I'm one of these people who I don't find the morality question that baffling, actually, at all. And when I'm asked, how can we possibly ground morality? My answer is we've been doing it. We've been doing it very well. And the thing that has really impressed me about morality is we're actually, it is a place where philosophy has made a difference, that there is room for reason. And there is a kind of forward movement in morality. We look back in absolute horror at things that our ancestors did. We look back in absolute horror even at some of the things that we did in our earlier life that we found. I've had quite a few men, some of them even in this room, say to me, when I was a young man, I just took it for granted that women cannot do math and physics. And, I just...
Which one of you said that?
That's right. Name names.
And I think that our great-grandchildren will look back at her and some of the things that we do. And one of the interesting things is that once something is seen with horror, we never go back. Once slavery is abolished, a country never reinstitutes slavery. There was one reversal, and that's when Napoleon came in, and he did in the colonies bring slavery back for a very short time. But that's the only reversal of forward movement that I can see. So there is a place for, and if you actually look back, you see philosophers actually making the first arguments when nobody's talking about it. And then, something happens. People write novels. What was it? Uncle Tom's Cabin, huge effect. But it started with John Locke in the 17th century making an argument about slavery, a very good argument, saying, look, if we're already committed to this, then on pains of inconsistency, we have to widen our notion of what creatures are treated with dignity. And so there is a place for reason here and for moral reason, given the background in evolutionary psychology, that there's something going on in evolutionary psychology. The other thing I just want to say is evolutionary psychology, is not enough. I've been interested by the work of Jonathan Haidt. I deplore the conclusions that he draws from it, but it's the different kinds of morality, all of which lie, different notions of morality, different sentiments of morality, all of which we can give evolutionary explanations for.
Do you want to state a little bit about what Height's result was?
Well, let me just, the five moral sources of different kinds of moral sentiments. One of them is derived from our evolutionarily explained feelings of disgust. There are good reasons for disgust. I was very amused by that review of McGinn's book you sent me. Thank you very much. But we have a good evolutionary, that basically our disgust is provoked by things that are carriers of pathogens. This gets generalized. We derive notions of bodily purity from it. I was brought up to moralize certain foods, that I had a moral revulsion. When I went to the supermarket, I saw pure, unadulterated lard, a hunk of lard, and it was a moral revulsion, that it was so impure. I've been talked out of that. There's group loyalty that people feel, that a lot of moral sentiments come from that. Again, we can explain that. A lot of things that we can judge quite immoral come from that. Xenophobia, we're really trained to deal with about 150,000 people, feel close to 150,000 people tops. That's the size of a tribe.
150.
150, did I say 150,000? 150, yes,
That's why Dan
150.
mentioned the thing about girls not doing math.
What else? Authority, following authority, equality and harm. Some of these things we can actually rationalize, I would say, so that, harm to others, fairness, there are arguments for this. The other ones, there's no way to really argue them.
The ones on the right, purity, authority, and loyalty.
You can't argue them, right? And so, and they crumbled.
I think those are moral values.
Well, they do for good evolutionary explanation, but, once, the truth is, moral psychology without moral philosophy is insufficient. And so, moral psychology will give you these 5, and you need moral philosophy to come in and say, look, and some of them are bogus, and some of them can be justified. So that's my little spiel about morality, and I think that, in fact, the second law gives us, since it gives us everything, all sorts of asymmetry, it actually gives us, in a way, morality. It gives us mattering. Because one thing that everybody knows, and all behavior is predicated on, is that I matter. And, I'm strategizing for my future. That's what, some of the strategies work and some of them don't, and when they work, my genes get passed on. But I am convinced, and I don't need any argument, it's just a given, that I matter. And that's a place where moral reasoning can latch on and expand. Say, Lo, you matter, either you're cosmically unique in this universe, or there are some other creatures that matter as well, and you can get going, and that's how we've been doing it. So that's my spiel. So, Steve.
Well, I agree with Rebecca that you can usefully reason about morality, and we do. But I think there's a narrower question, which is what impelled me to volunteer to say a few things, which is whether we can ground morality through science or any rational process. That is, if you ask about moral postulates, principles from which you can derive all your other moral judgments, is it possible to find such moral postulates by reasoning from things outside morality, like science or the theory of evolution or whatever? I'm impelled to raise this question by being thoroughly annoyed by Sam Harris's book, in which he claims science can provide a basis for moral postulates. I don't believe it. There's a long, honorable tradition of people who've denied this. I think David Hume is the obvious example. And I don't think I have to argue the case, because the burden of proof is surely on the other side. Those who think you can ground moral postulates in science or any other rational thought processes, I think have the burden of proof to do it, and I don't think anyone has ever successfully done so. I don't think Rebecca attempted to in the piece that I read on the plane coming here. She showed how you can evoke moral feelings by saying, well, I care about myself, so shouldn't I care about other people? But one possible answer is no. And there's no rational process that excludes that, it seems to me. On the other hand, as I said, I think there is room for reason in this area, because you might think that whether or not you can ground them in science or something like science, that you actually have moral postulates and you could try to figure out what they are. you can go beyond that and say, well, perhaps we all agree on our moral postulates. And then it really isn't important whether we can ground them in science. I mean, if everyone except crazy people and psychopaths have the same moral postulates, then that would be wonderful to find out. Even if you didn't know where they came from, you could say, well, that should be the basis of our system of justice, our laws, and our economic system, and so on. That would be great. What I want to argue is that that doesn't work either. That not only can you not ground moral postulates in science, but in fact, even people who you would normally think of as behaving in a moral fashion, people who are guided by a moral sense, nice people, and for example, me, do not in fact have a coherent set of moral postulates and don't really need them. Now, let me take a few examples of this. In high school, I was very pleased with myself for having decided that the fundamental principle that governs our actions should be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I didn't know that other people had gotten there ahead of me, and I was very chagrined to discover that people like Mill and Bentham had said something like this, but it still seemed to me almost self-evident that that's right. Well, I don't think, in fact, that is the way and I'm now publicly going through a sort of self-examination, which I think we all can do, and we can do both individually and collectively. I was disabused of this by reading a novel, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. He describes a society in which everyone is happy, except for one misfit. And everyone is happy because they're conditioned to be. The alphas who run things are happy because they're amused with sports and sex and drugs. And the other people who have to do the menial work of society have their brains before birth reduced in capacity so that they don't want to be alphas who have to think hard, but they're just happy sweeping the streets. And so everyone is happy. But, you know, it's intended to be a ghastly world, and it is. It's a world in which you have sex without passion and entertainment without culture and happiness without justice. So you realize, no, I'm not a, what is the word? I'm sorry. Yeah. That's not my moral postulate. Now, Sam Harris is aware of this kind of counter argument and says, well, it's not happiness, it's human welfare. Well, as you make things vaguer and vaguer, of course, it becomes harder and harder to say that it doesn't fit your own moral feelings, but it also becomes less and less useful as a means of making moral judgments. You could take that to the extreme and say it's make up some nonsense word and say that's the important thing, and no one could refute it, but it wouldn't be very helpful. I regard human welfare and the way Sam Harris refers to it as sort of halfway in that direction toward absolute nonsense. But there are other things that people would say, well, it may be that you can't postulate what is the good, that there are competing things which are all good, like happiness and truth, for example. We sacrifice some happiness when we accept the truth that we're not going to have life after death. Should we tell other people that they're not going to live after they die? It probably will reduce their happiness. On the other hand, truth has a value of its own. How do you balance truth and happiness? There isn't any algorithm for balancing that. I think you just have to accept that there's no postulate which allows you to judge how much happiness you're willing to give up for so much truth. Even people who accept all this will say, all right, we're not going to agree on what is the good, but at least we can agree on the fundamental principle of morality that something like Rawls' original condition, that we should not treat other people worse than we treat ourselves. Rebecca was saying something like this, that everyone equally deserves whatever is good, happiness or whatever it is. That's not the way I feel either. And I think it's probably not the way most of you feel if you think about it, because I could probably increase the total amount of happiness by making my family live on rice and beans and live in a one-room apartment and just barely keep enough money to keep us alive and healthy, and send all the rest of the money to poor parts of the world where it would do a lot more good than it does to me. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do, I'm not confessing immorality. I'm saying that my moral feelings tell me I should be loyal to my family. Similarly, when my university tries to recruit a bright young star in physics, I suppose I could calculate, well, he would really do more good for some other university. And the greater good would imply we shouldn't go after him, let some other university go after him. I don't care. I care about my university. I'm loyal to my university. Similarly, so their loyalty is a value. It's not an absolute value. I wouldn't cause, like Edward III, I wouldn't cause the 100 Years' War in order to advance the interests of my family. But it's one of these things where we have no algorithm for balancing loyalty against distributive justice. And I think we have to live with that. I think we have to live with the fact that although we can reason and try to uncover what our moral feelings are, and if we get into that, I think a very good example would be arguing about abortion. Maybe I'll come back to that in the discussion. We can reason. The reasoning uncovers how we feel morally, and perhaps allows us to identify areas of agreement so that we can cooperate with each other in bringing about what we want. I think in the end we have to live with not having a moral philosophy that really works in a decisive way. I think we have to live the unexamined life. I think this is part of the tragedy of the human condition, just like we have no absolute way of determining that Mozart is better than Led Zeppelin. We feel it, but it's not something that we can argue, we can rationally show. We have to live with the fact that, this came up yesterday, that when we discover the fundamental laws of physics from which everything in some sense, all other principles follow, we won't know why they're true. This is something that we have to accept, that the position of human beings is tragic, and part of the tragedy is that there is no way of deciding moral issues on the basis of, well, there is no way of deciding moral postulates which should govern our actions. And in fact, I don't think we have moral postulates which govern our actions, even when we behave morally.
I think you're too ambitious for morality, and because something, there are no algorithms, there are no postulates, all agreed. I don't think that that's the level on which we think morally, and a failure of that, which is impossible for us, doesn't mean that reason doesn't have a foothold and doesn't do its work. I think all we really need And it's not a postulate. It's implicit in behavior. I think it's implicit in animal behavior. I was very impressed with that TED Talk by Frans de Waal, where he has the capuchin monkey. It's a great thing. You got to watch it. There's this monkey, and first he's given cucumbers. He's right next door to another monkey whom he can see. He's given cucumbers, perfectly happy with the cucumbers. Then he sees his next door neighbor monkey has gotten grapes. The next time he gets the cucumber, he throws it in the experimenter''s face. He's outraged.
Rebecca, I just don't see, I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't see the relevance of it toward trying to fashion any kind of moral philosophy. Animal, I mean, you could equally well say, well, look at lions. You know, the male lion sits and eats and fornicates, and he has a pride of female lions that go out and do all the work. I mean, perhaps this feels right to lion. I suppose it does. And there may be good evolutionary reasons why lions behave this way, but it's an example that we would shun. I mean, finding here and there behavior which we sort of recognize as showing animals having some sense of fairness doesn't show us that we should be fair in that sense, or
No, it doesn't. But what it shows is that if animals reach a certain level of consciousness, they have a sense that there's stuff coming to them, and that there are certain emotions that come out of that, which are, you know, of unfairness, etc. And that it seems to me, gets normativity into it already. That notion of when a thing is treated a certain way, there was a reason not to treat it that way, and that animal, if it reaches some level of sophistication, especially with language, can actually articulate this. I mean, anybody who's raised children knows at about 2.5 or 3, they're articulating, you know, that's not fair. So that the commitment to oneself very quickly evolves into a notion of there are reasons that I shouldn't be treated this way. And that seems to me to already get normativity, and we can't live our lives without it. It's unavoidable. Those other moral emotions, purity, believe me, you can talk yourself out of it. I have no trouble with pig anymore. Loyalty, group authority, you can talk yourself out of all of that stuff, and I have, right? But this one, that if I think that I matter, and my life is impossible without thinking I matter, I just wouldn't act at all. I wouldn't plan for my future. I wouldn't do anything. If I think I matter, that's already getting normativity onto the page, it seems to me, and then we've got a footing. We can expand on that.
Well, I don't know how you talk yourself out of group loyalty. I mean, I have a feeling that it is right to be loyal to your group within limits. Go ahead, talk me out of it. I don't know how you can do that. It is not based on any reasoned judgment that this will make the world a better place. It just seems right to me, and I deny the capability of reason to change my mind about that.
Hold on a second. I think that there is quite a bit of that I agree with about what you said, particularly the criticism of Sam Harris and utilitarianism. Although that has been done very nicely on philosophical grounds, and of course utilitarians have their own comeback. It gets into a really complicated literature immediately. But for instance, when you said, I think that I morally owe more loyalty to, let's say, my friends and family and all that. There are ethical frameworks that do fit that kind of view. That's virtue ethics or communitarianism, for instance, which I happen to think it's... virtue ethics and communitarianism are exactly that kind of thing. So moral philosophy, moral reasoning in philosophy is not a way to ground anything on the basis of some kind of bedrock, nor is it a way to provide sort of universal answers, I think, not anymore at least. I mean, philosophers tried that for a while. I think it's a form of reasoning. It's like, okay, there's a large literature on how to think these things through. You do have to start with certain assumptions and axioms that can be questioned, but that's true for everything we do. It's true in science, it's true in mathematics, it's true in logic, so why wouldn't it be true in ethics? And then there are better and worse ways to reason your way through things. So if you want to, for instance, a very good example of how practical moral philosophical reasoning works, I think you can take a look at the last two books by Michael Sandel, who basically eschews all sort of broad talk about, is it utilitarianism that is better or the ontology or whatever it is. He just starts each chapter in those books with an actual question and reason his way through possible answers. And ethics becomes a tool to figure out certain things. Yes, there are limits. Now, in answer to your question about what kind of reasoning could possibly make me overcome xenophobia, well, there are attempts there too.
I didn't call it xenophobia.
Right. Well, so distrust of other groups. I mean, that's the idea. Well, there are reasons there too. There is attempts there too. Peter Singer's concept of an expanding circle is based on the idea that, yes, we start with the local group because that is the natural thing to do. It comes from the fact that we're social primates and all that. But then we think about it and say, well, although I have an instinctual reaction to where somebody looks different from me, if I stop and think about it, which is what philosophical reasoning is supposed to make you do, is I don't have any actual reason to believe that person is, in fact, inferior or dangerous or inherently so. And therefore, why should I treat him differently?
I'm sorry, I don't accept this. I'm not loyal to my family because I think other families are worse or because I distrust them or fear them. I'm loyal to my family because they're my family.
Yes.
And I think that's something I ought to do.
Yes.
Now, as I say, it's not an absolute thing. I would sacrifice some interest of my family for really great welfare of everyone. But I don't see any rational process that tells me how to make those trade-offs.
I got an idea. A rational process that will do this. You have to recognize that not all rational processes are fact-finding processes. Some of them are trying to come to an agreement about how we're going to proceed. And ultimately it's a political process, but that doesn't mean that it's not rational.
It's political in this very broad sense.
In the very broad sense, but actually also in a bit more normal sense. I find it useful to think about a question like, what game should we play? Should we play chess or should we change the rules of chess? Now, if you ask a question like that, you realize, well, who's we? Some people like one kind of game, some people like another kind of game. But if you take the human race, we'll leave the animals out because they're not responsive, they're not responsible. And let's just get the people that can talk, that can be part of this political workshop. And we're going to try to figure out what games ought we to play. Well, it's going to be normative because if we can agree, then this is what we're going to be bound by. And these are the oughts. Everything about who we are and how we got that way is relevant in the sense that, well, we're not going to play that game of chess because it takes 2 days between every move and people will just get bored out of their skulls. And similarly, we're not going to eliminate group loyalty because that's just too deeply ingrained in the human evolutionary past to tamper with. And we recognize that there's some relatively immovable dispositions. There's certain tastes, there's certain fears, but every single one of them is subject to rational criticism of the sort that Rebecca was talking about. We are reflective. Hume distinguished between the natural virtues and the artificial virtues. And the artificial virtues are those that are obtained by artifice. It is a result of reason and culture that we've come to endorse some virtues which are not directly grounded in our evolutionary past, but that honor it to the extent that we find it honorable. We recognize that we have some dispositions, some proclivities, that whether this is just an accident or whether it's deep, we no longer honor that. We think that those are, for instance, a certain sort of vengefulness. We might think, this is something we want to damp down. We don't need this anymore. We understand where it came from. We can harness it to some degree to motivate us to have the courage to punish the miscreants around us. But there's a process, and this is, I think, what Massimo was saying. There's an ongoing historical process of refinement. Everything is officially up for grabs. There's no algorithms. There's no final postulates. But this is the best game we figured out to play so far.
Best according to what?
According to us. That is, and who else should matter more?
Let's try out to put a bit of structure on the relationship between three things: the moral psychology, the moral philosophy, and the politics standards. So some facts about people are: we all have preferences. We have different preferences from each other. Furthermore, those preferences are not things we all arrive at as individuals, right? Our preferences are themselves products of social coordination dynamics, and different people and different groups have different histories of social coordination dynamics. Then, all the same thing can be said again about the fact that we all moralize some of our preferences, right? And when you moralize a preference, you treat it differently than you treat a non-moralized preference. Even people who have almost exactly the same preferences may disagree on which preferences should be moralized. Furthermore, it matters to all of us which preferences other people moralize, because that'll affect the way they deal with us. We have to do politics around around the coordination of our preferences, and we also have to do politics, and do politics, around the moralization of our preferences. And both the formation of preferences and the moralization of of some of those preferences, both of those things are malleable in response to some extent, in response to consideration of consequences. So sometimes people will change their preferences or drop a moralization of a preference or moralize something they didn't use to moralize in light of facts that they're made aware of that they hadn't been made aware of. But also there's a very, very strong aesthetic component, right? So many of our moralized preferences are based on judgments of what seems to us to be attractive, both characters of people and characters of certain kinds of acts and certain kinds of lives and so on. And all that's fair game. The complexity of the games we play around the coordination over both what preferences to have and what preferences to moralize, the complexity of those games is very, very great, but most people are really quite good at it. Right? But the level of information, just in the sense that we're able to do a great deal of computation.
Pritzker, were you about to intervene?
When you're done.
I'll stop. You get where I'm.
I must be the only lawyer in the group, but I don't have an answer on morality. I'm very skeptical of morals generally. I'm not sure I believe they exist. I do believe in law, and it's obvious all cultures have laws. The cultures have different laws. Clearly, there are modes of behavior that are helpful in a culture to perpetuate that culture, and laws seem to be an inevitable aspect of cultures. What I worry about with morality is another type of legal system, which is hazier and which suggests that there is some kind of absolute right and wrong, and has its own kinds of punishment outside of a legal system. That punishment could be guilt, it could be a banishment, it could be, did I say guilt? And I worry that that's very hazy. And I question, incidentally, that we're improving in our moral standards significantly. I do think that education suggests that we have a different view of the golden rule. And I like both statements of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In other words, if you torture them, look out when it's your turn to get tortured. That's, to me, the golden rule. It's going to be your ass next, so watch out. Clearly, we behave in that way, both individually and between cultures. The other aspect of the golden rule still pertains, which is the one where the gold makes the rules. Those rules don't necessarily create a fair or aesthetic situation to the people that are having their rules dictated to them. I'd like to actually ask Richard what he thinks about this. I'm very uneasy in morality. I don't think there's an absolute. Richard, I'd like to know how you see this from animal behavior to human culture, and what laws we have that are in fact genetically motivated, and which are merely culturally motivated, and if those in fact have the same general purpose.
When I first became a fellow of New College, the fellow in law there, an academic lawyer called Tony Honore, said to me, "Do animals have law?" And I wasn't really able to give a straight answer to that. I was impressed with Rebecca's historical demonstration of the way things improve, and obviously Steve Pink has written about this. He got it from me.
Now we know.
And I've long felt that the way I put the same point is that we who live in the early 21st century are labeled as 21st century moralists, people with 21st century values. The difference between the extremes of today, the George W. Bush or the Donald Rumsfeld of today, and the more progressive elements today, is smaller than the difference between the anybody today and anybody not just 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. It's dramatic the way our moral values, the ones that everybody accepts, not the ones that we reason about as moral philosophers, but the ones that simply are part of the culture, part of dinner party conversation, just the ordinary assumptions. In the 19th century, T.H. Huxley, I suppose, was in the vanguard of progressive liberal thought. But it would never once have occurred to T.H. Huxley that black people were remotely comparable to white people in ability. It was just a given. And Huxley used rather sort of patronizing language about black people. So we're all changing from century to century, from decade to decade. And this seems to be, as Rebecca said, a kind of not totally irreversible process, but there's very little evidence that it's ever reversed. Now, if we extrapolate into the future, Peter Singer's not here, but I'm very struck by the fact that the whole conversation is about maximizing happiness, the greatest number. There's an implicit human stuck in there, and when you think as an evolutionist, there doesn't seem to be any reason to do that. I mean, it's almost just that it's a historical accident, a very convenient accident, that all the intermediates between ourselves and other species happen to be extinct. That's why we're able to talk about morality as though it was a purely human problem, as though the only alternative to we're just arguing about whether we go with Stephen Weinberg and say we look after our own family, or we worry about the people starving in India or something. What about the other species? I'd just like to add one thought, since I've been asked about animal behavior. When you take Bentham's famous remark about the question is not can they think, can they reason, but can they suffer? If you actually ask what suffering is for, what the Darwinian function of suffering is, it's clearly to teach a lesson to the animal, don't do that again. If you've just done something that gives you pain, don't repeat it. and that has obvious Darwinian value. Now, if you ask yourself, those species that can think and reason, how much pain would they need in order to deter them from doing something silly again? The answer is surely, or at least we should consider the answer to be, they need less pain. If they can think and reason, then it should take a less painful stimulus to put them off doing the silly thing again. Whereas an animal that cannot think and reason, or is very poor at thinking and reasoning, is going to need more pain. And so far from assuming that a species which can think and reason probably has a greater capacity to suffer, which we, I think, unconsciously all do, we might actually at least consider the opposite proposition, that a species that can think and reason has less capacity to suffer. I'm not necessarily arguing for that, but at least it's something that we should consider without just ignoring it.
Can I respond? One of the things that troubles me about the discussion, and I really like the move to human-animal comparison, is that we're at the top end of the story, what's good, what's right, and so on. We have pretty clear ideas of what George Bush might have called evil. Certainly when someone tortures another for some personal value, some personal good, we recognize there's something fundamentally wrong with that. When I have many colleagues that have studied primates, particularly chimpanzees, and have now seen a number of films, videos taken where chimpanzees have torn other chimpanzees limb from limb while they're alive, in just killing them in this process. And they do this, of course, when they kill monkeys for food. It's a horrific thing to watch because I'm inside that monkey's head that's getting torn apart. I get the suffering. I can, in a sense, though I don't suffer myself, I can anticipate what that suffering is. And I think the suffering piece is right. We as human beings, looking at this, I don't think that this chimpanzee is morally corrupt because he's done this. But if I saw a human being doing that, especially an adult, young children maybe not, but especially adult, I would find something terribly repulsive about this. And what it is that I recognize that that adult can get inside the head of somebody else, can, in a sense, intersubjectively get a sense of what's going on, anticipate it. And when someone tortures someone else, it's because they can do that, because they can reason. So I like to think about it, that one of the greatest gifts we have is to be able to get inside of each other's head. It's sort of using this greatest gift we've been given that other species don't have against other species. It's a remarkably horrific thing to watch and to think about. And one of the things that I think at the bottom end of things, rather than talk about the good and the stuff, I think we can be pretty clear about what's at the bottom end. What we say, no, And if we have some pretty clear understandings of that, I think it's a good hint to move our way up. Why it is that we don't hold 4-year-olds responsible for murder, even if they've killed somebody. Why we don't hold people who are mentally ill, schizophrenic, and thinking that somebody else is a demon. Why we don't hold them responsible. And I think it has to do with a reasoning issue.
Terry, are you sure that you're not, when you see somebody being torn limb from limb, how much is it that you are empathetic with them, and how much is it you're worried that you're going to be the next one that gets torn limb from limb if that kind of behavior is allowed to persist?
Well,
I admire you if it's the former.
Well, so what I'm saying is,
I will tell you.
I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about watching an animal get torn limb from limb.
No, you said how you would feel to see a human being.
No,
get torn
it's
limb
yes,
from limb.
it's imagining myself in that mind.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Good.
Well,
That's why we have
I
laws.
think you may have suggested a reason for what Rebecca and I agree on is the amazing, and Richard, the amazing moral improvement that we've seen. And that is, it comes from empathy, it comes from recognizing that other people are like oneself. And where does that come from? Well, I think why has it gotten better? It may be simply because people are more literate, and we go to the movies and we see people living lives. I think the image of Sidney Poitier behaving in a way that we would recognize we might behave in movies, for example, had a tremendous effect in improving race relations in this country. Just simply we're exposed to other people in literature, in newspapers, in movies, and so we improve in our treatment of them. I wanted to go back to what Pritzker said about haziness. I agree. I think that moral judgments are irreducibly hazy, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see any reason for saying I distrust morality. I think aesthetic judgments are also irreducibly hazy. So what? I think not everything is mathematics, and we have to live with a morality which cannot be reduced to rational judgment. I still insist, I'm delighted to find an issue on which I seem to disagree with other people here, because I was afraid that what I was saying would be so completely obvious to everyone, it would be a waste of time. But I continue to take the example of vengeance, which someone mentioned in passing. Should we, in addition to deterrence or just putting people away so that they can't continue their crimes, should we also exert vengeance on people who do evil things? I think so.
So do I.
Yeah, I don't, and
But I don't call it vengeance, I call it punishment.
well,
Punishment
punishment.
and vengeance are different.
Well, vengeance is more
Well,
personal. I'm not. Yeah. All right. I don't want to argue.
Yes,
that.
we should punish.
Yeah, I think people who do evil things should be punished, and I'm happy if they are. And it has nothing to do with deterrence or reforming them or anything else. I think Hitler, unfortunately, he put himself outside the reach of punishment, but I think Hitler should be punished because he's evil. This comes back to the question about free will and so on. The fact that if we lived in a deterministic universe, or in a universe where determinism is qualified by the randomness in quantum mechanics, I would still say Hitler should be punished because he's evil. It doesn't matter why he became evil. Maybe because his father beat him. I don't care. He's evil. He should be punished.
What's his evil haziness? Was there a haziness to his evilness from your perspective?
No, but I think there is a haziness in balancing this kind of judgment with other judgments. There may be, for example, prudential arguments for not going out and punishing people who do evil things, depending on how evil it is. And there's an irreducible haziness in trading off one value against another value. We have no way, I claim, of calculating, for example, how much of society's resources should go into punishing evil people.
But you do have a pretty clear line from what you just said about who's evil and who's not, or what is evil and what's not.
Well, even there might be, no, I'm not.
But Hitler has clearly crossed that line.
Yeah, I mean, everyone uses Hitler because he's
Stalin
so far.
crossed that line for you, perhaps.
Yeah.
I actually think that there's maybe I'm just optimistic, but a surprising potential for agreement here so far in the room. I should parenthetically say that Peter Singer was invited, but he has a moral reason for not traveling on weekends that reduces to loyalty to his family. I was thinking of using a utilitarian counterargument, but as Massimo says, whether it's science or morality or whatever, we have some axioms, we have some assumptions, and then we get off the ground. But I think that what Steve is getting at correctly is that the kinds of axioms you need to get morality off the ground, the kinds of postulates, are very, very different than the kinds of axioms you would need to get science off the ground. I mean, science really has these very thin methodological axioms about, the world is not trying to trick us when we collect data.
I'm denying having axioms.
Well, yes, so that's where I would actually disagree, but I think
The world
that...
does try to trick us when we collect social scientific data.
Well, it effectively does, but...
Science is pretty shaky too, as Hume showed us. I mean, we can't justify regularity, and we have to just, we just operate within as if we're justified in believing, in regularity.
I'm not going to rise to that provocation because I want to keep going, but that's a very interesting issue to talk about. Yeah, that would be fine. But the kinds of axioms, the postulates or whatever to get morality going, are closer to the scientific theories that we have. When we postulate, that Schrodinger's equation is right or that Einstein's equation is right, and then we can go out and test it in some way. That's what we need to sort of make predictions and do things. And the kinds of axioms you need for morality just don't have that testability or sort of verifiability.
Well, they do in terms of whether, you could make a rule that there is no such thing as morality. There's a series of feelings that we have that enable us to live harmoniously in our society and in our world. And I think that's where animal-derived morality is continuous with human morality.
Well, sure, but I think we all seem to agree that just because evolution has given us some impulses, some tendencies, doesn't make them right in the sense that we use the word right.
It isn't clear that living harmoniously in our world is the test for.
That is right, but I would nevertheless agree with Rebecca that we can apply. We do, rather than universal postulates that we all can sort of argue for on the basis of reason or evidence. We all have something inside us that we recognize as our own personal version of morality, and it's not universal, right? It's different, and it comes from evolution and from society, as Don says, and many other things. And I think what we seem to be maybe moving toward is this idea that the job of morality is just very different from the job of science, because we take all of these individual, very different tendencies that we have, and then we reason about them. And that's the sort of political kind of thing that Dan was pointing to. And it might be logical and rational, and we might hope, I'm not nearly as pessimistic as Steve, you seem to be, that we couldn't take those inchoate, vague tendencies we have and think hard about them and turn them into a logical set of postulates that we could then move forward on. I think that at least some of the progress of how we treat each other over the last several hundred years is due to people thinking about it. I'm sure that if you told Thomas Jefferson that slavery was bad, he would say, in some sense slavery is bad, but I have other, moral things that overrule it for me. And we talked ourselves out of that. And I think that it's a very different kind of process than we undergo under science, and none of us seems to be defending the idea that we will reduce morality to science. But I still think that everything that people have said so far is compatible with the idea that we can capture morality in a reasonable philosophical framework.
Can I make a point about let's be careful not to treat ourselves as models of people generally, right? Because yes, we self-consciously reflect on this. I'll give a simple example, but with respect to this moral progress stuff. So when I was a kid, when I was a child, my parents thought that gay people were worse than criminals, right? They basically thought gay people should not, it was just an instinctive judgment that they did not think gay people should be able to participate in society at all. Well, now my parents are still alive and they have gay friends. They have conventional liberal morality about gay people. And this process happened very, very slowly. I don't think they ever really thought about it much at all, right? We're all in a state all the time of kind of indoctrinating each other and coordinating, and that the targets, the circumstances under which we do this coordination are themselves socially evolving. So there was no magic line. There was no day on which my parents had benighted attitudes towards gays and then enlightened attitudes towards gays. They just broadened. they just changed, and that's what all people are doing all the time. Of course, it's no surprise, in light of that we should see this kind of dramatic moral change over the last couple of hundred years, because of course the wider economic and political circumstances of people have changed much, much more faster and much, much more dramatically since the Industrial Revolution than they ever did before. So people in 1700 didn't live all that differently from people in 1300, but people in 2012 lived very, very differently indeed from people in 1912.
One thing I also just wanted to say in relation to animals is that, and it relates to what you're saying as well, is that it's there's a lot of upheaval along the way, and often the victims or the people who want to be let in to this nice moral circle have to advocate for themselves. So black people organize, Females organize. Animals can't organize. They can't advocate for themselves. And so, and I think that's a very, very big difference and why. But, this thing doesn't happen smoothly, and it doesn't happen just through reason, for sure. I do think that the first step is reason, and there's a moral philosopher. For those who say that nothing ever happens in philosophy, look at the history of moral progress. You'll find a philosopher inserting himself before, or herself, before, even that. Who would have even said, even who would have inserted, or herself. Anyway, I promised Owen and
Owen
then
first, yeah.
So I wanted to Richard was talking at breakfast about some things that weren't coming up, and I think that this is a very helpful discussion. And I just want to take it back for a moment to our general themes about how a naturalist approaches, and I think it's coming out here, but I just want to see if I'm right about this, how a naturalist approaches the domain of morality, and how a naturalist thinks about whether there is such a thing as moral knowledge, and if so, what kind of knowledge it is. I think that's what's been emerging here. And I want to I just happen to have this in front of me in something that I passed around, but this is a quote from John Dewey, and I want to put it into contrast with what most people out of this room think that moral knowledge is, because I think that most people think moral knowledge has something to do with grounding, and in particular has to do with theological grounding. This is Dewey says this. This is 1922. He says, moral science is not something with a separate province. It is physical, biological, and historic knowledge placed in a humane context where it will illuminate and guide the activities of men. And so that's a very, what we'd call in philosophy, non-foundationalistic view. And that's, I think, what's being supported by most of the people here have been speaking. It's that Aristotle says this at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, actually. He says, it's something like this. That's what he just says. We can't ask for the same precision in ethical or political discourse. And actually, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, now I've told you all what I think about ethics, like what virtues should be inculcated in the children, which ones are good ideas, which ones are better ideas than others. And now I better go on and do politics, because you can't do ethics without a notion of a good society. And that and you could easily imagine if Aristotle had written about politics first, he would have ended that book by saying, now I need to go back and tell you in a more fine-grained way about sort of what we should say about individuals and about. So, but I think here, what I wanted to point out to people, this is a conception of ethical, if there is ethical knowledge, of what we would say is kind of practical knowledge that we do by conversation, sometimes just to ourselves, but sometimes, as Dan was saying, we're trying to agree about what norms should govern our activity and what we should do next as a group. And it's not grounded in a sense of, grounded in self-evident axioms that have wide swaths that everyone can agree on. And it is historical. I think that's the important thing about the Dewey thing, and an important thing about what Rebecca was saying. And I call your attention to the fact that there's more than one group who actually challenge this kind of, I think, naturalistic view. One are the people, and this is important about Hume, and I just want to, not that anyone's brought it up, but in the famous passage where David Hume says you can't go from ises to oughts, he's actually talking. I mean, that makes some people think that it's naughty to do ethics at all, like what are we doing? And this would be bad for a naturalist. Like when we say things like, you ought to tell the truth, like where's the fact that corresponds to? And if you have a certain kind of view about the world, some people would say, if you're scientistic, I'm going to wake my colleague up. If you're scientistic, there's nothing that corresponds to, so what hold does it have for a naturalist? And this is, of course, the worry that, the Dostoevskian worry that if there is no God, then everything's allowed. And Hume is actually talking about this. He's talking in the treatise on human nature when he says, you can't go from is to oughts, that is, you can't demonstrate. He actually uses the language, you can't demonstrate moral facts, meaning you can't deduce them. And he's talking about clerics. They're always trying to do this. They tell you things like, God said such and so, you want to do such and so, but that would be wrong to do. And then he goes on for 200 more pages in the treatise, or 150, to do what we would call moral philosophy, moral thinking. He just doesn't try to demonstrate anything, because that's not what ethics does. It doesn't have, and so this would go back to, I think, Stephen's point about It's an area or a zone of human life where it involves very complex negotiations about what we ought to do next, what are good ideas. Maybe the way to put it is, it involves reasonable people talking in reasonable ways about what they're seeing about their own nature, what they're seeing about what the world is calling upon them to think or do, and trying to resolve complicated practical problems. But I call your attention to the fact that people like Sam Harris, which and this is true of Ed Wilson did this too in On Human Nature. He claimed to be able to derive moral norms from certain facts. These would be facts about human nature. And the point is that in either case, it's just a logical point. You can't actually derive them in the logical sense. But what you can do is you can say things like, given our nature of people who are partial to our loved ones and our families, we ought to think about accommodating this somehow in our morality. And almost every great world tradition, Confucianism is a good example, but our traditions are good examples, have tried to accommodate this. We don't even, I think we shouldn't think that there are algorithms to do this. We should think that these are complex kinds of practical negotiations that we make with ourselves and with others. But notice, that then says ethics is not a separate domain of knowledge. It's probably continuous with prudential and practical knowledge of all other kinds of sorts. It just maybe has to do with matters of perhaps greater importance, or what we take to be greater importance.
I mean, I was just wanted to say, maybe tangentially your point or directly. And Rebecca started by saying that we start with the philosophy and we derive actions from that. What you're saying, I think, or what I agree with, is that maybe we should dispense with the idea of morality and right and wrong, decide what kind of society we want and how we need to behave to achieve that society, and then the behaviors that we need to achieve that society we call right and wrong afterwards, rather than just go with our pre-existing feelings, which may not be, as Richard pointed out, prudent in this kind of world now.
Well, I think that actually a lot of moral philosophy does that already. I mean, my sense of, that's not my specialty, but my sense of where moral philosophy is now is essentially that people got away largely from foundationalism kind of approaches, and that's, people are rephrasing things in way, yes. So things that are morally, when I say something is right or wrong, I mean within this particular context for these particular reasons. So I think actually this is already happening, but I wanted to go back to both Hume and to some extent Aristotle. So Hume and Aristotle, I think, and other moral philosophers realized that part of the discourse here is that it doesn't make sense to talk about ethics or morality unless you have a reasonable understanding of human nature, or a reasonable theory of human nature. That is, morality is grounded in human nature. Now, of course, the whole concept of human nature is a whole other, very difficult thing, and Richard reminded us that there is one human nature maybe now, but there may have been a bunch of human natures in the past, right? But I think that without taking the concept of human nature as too written in stone and certainly not fixed over time, there is an interesting sense in which human beings are different from other beings, social or non-social, smart or intelligent or non-intelligent, and so on. And so we have a certain set of desires and preferences and emotions and so on and so forth, which evolved over time. Now, Hume was interestingly involved at some point in this debate that was going on at the time between different conceptions of human nature. There were people that were arguing that humans are inherently, selfish bastards, and other people that were arguing that human beings are inherently good, doing social beings, cooperative, and so on and so forth. And Hume got into these things saying, look, as it turns out, things are not that simple. We probably did start out in a certain way. Of course, he didn't have an evolutionary perspective on things, right? We're talking before Darwin, right? But he says, there is probably such a thing as a fundamental, probably somewhat selfish nature that we all share, but that nature has changed over time because of culture. Because we think about things, we talk about it with each other, we write novels, we produce television shows and not at the time obviously, and movies and all that, and that is part of a conversation. So that yes, we started in a certain direction, but we're progressing, we're moving in different directions that seem to be emerging of this continuous process of reflection and confrontation to some extent, and that's what morality is. Now that isn't that different, I think. And I'm making a leap here from say, an Aristotelian conception of things. Aristotle was a little more seriously grounded in sort of concept of human nature. But he also emphasized that morality, being virtuous, doing the right thing, developing the right character, to a large extent is a matter of luck. You have to grow up, be lucky to grow up in the right environment, right education, right family, supportive social environment, and so on and so forth. If you don't do that, you're better off. You're going to become, a monster or a cripple from an ethical perspective. So he was very aware of the fact that morality is, in fact, a communitarian thing. That a communitarian thing. It emerges from the community, from your parents, from your teachers. That's why he put so much emphasis on early development, we would say today. But then he also said, yes, but you can also practice it. You become more and more virtuous as you practice things. You reflect on things and say, okay, well, I have a tendency to do this, but this tendency is actually not that good, and I should work on it. I should change it. And the more you do that, the more natural it becomes.
Another piece of conventionalism about morality. By conventionalism, I mean something false. Another bit that we should be, I think, careful of it. Owen said, well, morality, these moral judgments are particularly important. Well, sometimes they are, but often that's not a strong or pure correlation either. We have a tendency when we have these discussions to focus on very, very weighty things, slavery and Hitler, and but in fact, the cultural practices around which preferences it's reasonable to moralize doesn't track the unimportant distinction, it seems to me. Right? We're in a meeting, I see a senior colleague deliver a mild status insult to a junior colleague that I think is undeserved, and I think, asshole, you just lost a month off your sabbatical. So I moralize it, right? And I let myself moralize it. I could stop myself from moralizing it, but no, I think that's okay. That's a good, decent thing to moralize. Whereas, I also wish people would park straight in the parking lot because, then I could fit my car. Sometimes I can't fit my car in this, but if I found myself moralizing that, right, it's not to do with then I'd criticize myself. So, and stop it. Well, it's not that one thing is all that important. Rather, the status insult in the meeting is minor. The parking issue is also minor. Right? There's these deep, and part of the reason why I think it's okay to moralize is that most of the people in my reference group would also think it was okay to moralize there, so I could defend myself in terms they'd understand. Most of the people in my reference group would not agree that it's okay to moralize parking straight. And I could not. I would feel a bit silly if I got caught moralizing that.
I think this is really. I can't believe you guys are all talking about morality. This blows my mind, really. And I really think that you hit it when you talked about good ideas and bad ideas. I don't think there's morality. I think there's good ideas and bad ideas. It's a bad idea to berate an associate. Why? The associate might quit, might be unmotivated, will subvert your department. It's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to park crooked. It's inefficient in the parking lot. It makes things difficult. It slows the system. It's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to tear somebody apart limb from limb. Why? Because the next one's going to be you. And I also think that the notion that we have such an improved society, and I do think, Rebecca, you hit it when you said we've got a way to go. If you don't think that there's torture in this country, there is. There are multiple thousands of people in solitary confinement that are put there, not through a judicial process by wardens with no process of appeal. That's going on in this country. So before we all say how moral we are, how many people are doing anything about that? Or capital punishment in California, or a lot of things that you might think are immoral, and I would say are just bad ideas. So I think there are bad ideas and good ideas. Wait, let me finish. That we codify into laws, and I think that's a great idea to codify the good societal ideas into laws with very clear. And by the way, I completely disagree on your punishment thing. We can talk about that. I believe in deterrence. I believe in rehabilitation. On punishment, if you want to tear people limb from limb because you think that Hitler is bad, go ahead and do it if it's within the law. But I don't think that there is any overriding morality about who should be punished and who shouldn't. So I think that's a very slippery slope.
You remind me of the economist that the businessman rather, that Keynes wrote about. He said he meets businessmen who say, I have no use for economic theory. and then they present a set of ideas which, according to Keynes at least, are half-baked economic theory left over from some discredited economist of the past. I mean, you say you don't believe in morality, and then you say there are bad ideas. Well, you're talking about morality. They're bad ideas because your moral view is that they're bad.
That they have
It's not a moral
consequences.
view, it's not a moral view, it's a reason.
Well, you don't like the consequences.
It's a reason.
I mean, the
It's
reason
not
you
a
don't
moral
like the
view.
consequences
It might be
is,
semantic,
I mean, you don't
but-
like these people being in solitary confinement because you have a sense which you don't want to call moral, but which everyone else would, that this is immoral to put these people in solitary confinement. You're avoiding the issue of how to make that kind of judgment by just saying, well, they're bad ideas. Well, what makes them bad ideas is very difficult to explain. It's not obvious.
It's easier to figure out than what's right or wrong. I mean, I can tell you why it's a bad idea to not let people park in handicap spots, but I can't tell you why it's a bad idea to not let homosexuals practice homosexuality behind closed doors. And it's consequential.
When you say it, yeah, it's consequentialist, but why is it a bad consequence that handicapped people won't be able
Well,
to?
I think we're going to get closer to what we should do and what we shouldn't do from looking at consequences than we are from a
Of
priori.
course you look at
Jerry, I'm with you
consequences,
on
but you
that.
have to judge the consequences, and you judge them according to your moral view. You think it's immoral that poor handicapped people won't be able to have a short walk to where they have to go.
I think moral views are malleable. I don't think that,
I'm not talking about that, but you're trying to distinguish thinking about consequences from making moral judgments. I'm saying that's no distinction, because you have to judge the consequences according to a sense, according to a moral sense.
Yeah, but the moral senses are malleable. I mean, Sam Harris would say that the consequentialist view of taking care of your family above other people, which you feel is the right thing to do, is because actually it's a society in which you pay more attention
It's a
to
good
family than
idea.
other people is
It's
better
a good idea.
than another society.
But if I calculated that it wasn't better, I would still do it.
Well,
because
but you're not okay. But other people feel differently from that.
Well, that's right, and I'm saying that there's no way of settling the argument between me and them. Now, I'm not arguing for my moral judgments as opposed to other people's. I'm saying there's no way of settling the issue.
But I mean, if
Well,
Dan,
you know, there is a way, and actually, I think we're all very close to it. Let me try to put together what we've been saying. We start off with prudence, with prudential ideas. What's a good idea? What's a bad idea? But we have compatriots that we want to get to agree on this. So we engage in mutual persuasion. Now, mutual persuasion is a somewhat rational process. It's not just rationality, because a lot of mutual persuasion consists in dramatizing the plights of others through novels and movies and all the rest of that thing. And what we have to remember is that when you persuade somebody of something, you've changed them. Their human nature is a little bit different than it was before. So it's always a moving target. We're different from our parents and our grandparents. And out of this process, which has a large measure of rationality, because completely irrational arguments are just not persuasive. We are that rational. This drives a process of refinement. We have law, which codifies some of it. We have our moral judgments, which decide which laws are acceptable to us and which laws aren't. And the philosopher Alan Gibbard has a lovely phrase for this. He says, don't try for some absolute. He says, whatever we come up with is going to be parochial, but we want parochiality with the widest possible parish. We want to include, we want to be inclusive, but recognize that however inclusive, however expanded the circle is, that circle of us has a human nature. Or if we ever figure out how to include animals, we can't include animals in the persuasion circle. And that is, I think, a morally significant fact. It means that, for one thing, we don't hold animals responsible for whatever they do. because they're not responsive. You cannot reason with. But now it looks to me as if what the view I've just articulated seems to me to honor Jerry's point that we figure out what kind of society we want to live in, and that we said that's what morality is. This is the best game to play. And we then, as Don says, we moralize some of that, and we say this isn't just prudence. This is got the extra oomph of morality. And is there a sharp line between morality and prudence? No. Don't look for sharp lines, as usual. The Darwinian messages, don't look for sharp lines. And still, even though you can't define the line between prudence and morality, that doesn't mean you can't define the difference between night and day. You can still say torture isn't just a bad idea in the sense of well, you know, somebody then might want to torture you. It's clearly on the night side of the night-day boundary.
So let me. There's an elephant in this room that's not come out yet, and it has to do with the disconnect between this morning's discussion and yesterday's discussion. Everything that's been said here by just about everyone would, I think, fall into the category of emergent. That this is not just quarks and gluons and their relationships. The question is, if we're going to be these really hard-nosed naturalists that some of us want to be, at least, I'd like to hear that other side. That is, if this is not emergent, if this is something that's just quarks and gluons, then why are we worried about all this stuff? And is it just fluff?
Can I add to that? Can I amplify that question for a second? I'm at this point completely confused. And the discussion has been so abstract that my question is for Sean and for Stephen. I'm persuaded that there should be no postulates or principles that act the same way as physical theory may be, and so therefore it's on a different. Maybe it's an emergent. But let's take fermions don't make moral judgments. People do, and in particular, it's the brain part of people that does. And so if I make a particular judgment, it's a moral judgment is not an undecomposed whole. A bunch of stuff goes into that. I could write a computer program probably. Those subcomponents, those you probably would concede I can study using naturalistic inquiry. So is there that much of a disconnection between studying individuals and making a moral judgment and then generalizing? Because then we're in a different, then it's emergent in the sense that it's discontinuous. There's a discontinuity between talking about individual psychology and morality in a group, which is puzzling to me.
Well, I don't.
It's not, but it's troubling because I actually do think we can study an individual. Let's say Stephen says he wants to help, his department or his family. We can figure that out. That means you draw on your memory, on your perceptual apparatus, on decision making, and we take all those things to be part of psychology that we can in fact study in a completely naturalistic way.
We can certainly study what people do in a completely naturalistic way, and then
including their moral judgments.
Including their moral judgments, but then it's a different question about how you would study what people should be doing. And I think, but if it's very well in, as Terry is pointing out, I mean, there's a reason why we had yesterday's discussion and then today's discussion. I would say that the right way to think about everything we're saying here is as an emergent set of phenomena, and I would say the way I like to talk about it is what we were calling levels or scales or whatever are just different models, different theories, different vocabularies, different ontologies, if you want to go that far, for talking about the same underlying reality. And the point of today's discussion, I would say, has been that, or I would even say stories or narratives, just to irk Alex. So we have a story that we tell about atoms, we have a story that we tell about fluids, we have a story that we tell about human beings and their psychology, we have a story we tell about right and wrong. And the difference is that we choose which stories to believe in, to tell each other, and to proceed on the basis of, in a different way when they're purely descriptive scientific stories than when they're moral stories. When we attach meaningness of this is a good act or a bad act, whether you want to call it moral or not, I kind of agree with Steve that there's not much of a distinction, it's just a vocabulary distinction. So we're deciding whether or not in the emergent behavior of human beings to label a certain thing bad, morally bad, or morally good. And the basis on which we make that choice, I think, as we're saying here, is a different kind of basis than the evidentiary scientific hypothesis testing basis. It's one that says, well, we all have certain beliefs, we all have certain inclinations, and we're trying to reconcile them and communicate about them and tell each other compelling narratives and things like that. But recognizing that
Are
distinction.
those beliefs and narratives not subject to the same kind of inquiry?
No, I mean, I would say that if someone says that parking in a handicapped space to save yourself a little bit of time going to the grocery store is okay, I would absolutely deny that they are wrong in the same sense as someone who says the universe is not expanding is wrong. They're both wrong, but in completely different senses. One is just objectively wrong because they're getting the universe wrong. One, I believe is wrong and would try to persuade you is wrong on the basis of my moral judgments that hopefully I overlap with you enough to make that case.
Well, except you could say, if everybody parked in handicapped spaces, our society wouldn't function as well.
And why do we want society to function? I mean, there had
judge whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Exactly. We used to have handicapped spaces.
I mean, you seem to be regarding the proper functioning of society as an unquestioned basis for judging everything else. But that's a moral judgment just like everything else.
But cultures
Sure it
develop
is.
legal systems seemingly for that reason.
Yeah.
We've got a very
Well, I
complicated
don't care whether you
society.
use the word, but I don't see any distinction between that and other moral judgments.
In Alabama, the handicap parking story completely unraveled because doctors started giving handicap stickers to all their friends until everyone had a handicap sticker. And then the handicap, of course, and so that this caused an expansion in the number of handicap bays, right? Until virtually all the bays were handicap bays and everyone had a handicap sticker. So the handicapped were then walking further than ever, right? Because
But there is an interesting sense in which presumably we're hearing that story right now and we say, well, those doctors were wrong. And that sense, I agree with Carroll, is very different. It was Carroll Wushan. I keep writing your last names on the Twitter feed. With Wushan, when he says, that's wrong, and it's strictly a very, very different way from which,
although notice something,
denying evolution is wrong.
Notice something else about this example, though, right? If only one doctor was doing it, right, we would be very strongly inclined to make a moral judgment about that doctor. Once all the doctors are starting to do it, it's not so clear, right? Suppose all the doctors are doing it and I go, and now I can't park, right? So I go to my doctor and I say, I need a handicap sticker like everyone else, right? Now, if my doctor refuses, I might moralize that, right? The opposite. In other words, it's not as if we have an orderly sort of set of behaviors and then an orderly set of people, and we assign the judgments once and for all, independently of the social dynamics, right? One of the reasons that axioms and postulates have nothing to do with moral evaluation is because it's a very fluid and dynamic process. We're always we're constantly all revising our judgments of how the equilibrium, where there are equilibria in our interlocking sets of judgments.
Yeah, and it seems, I agree with you very much, Steve, that using the flourishing of society, the well-functioning of society, is not the be-all and end-all. Slave societies function very well. Our society probably functioned much, much better when women were in the house and taking care of the kids. It's much more complicated now. I can't believe I said that. But there's a lot of chaos, and we're still trying to figure this out. It's the smooth functioning of society doesn't answer all of the moral questions. Who do we bring into the discussion? You say we all sit around and we have a discussion. Well, who do we bring into the discussion? That's often the most important moral move. That's where the real moral discussion takes place.
I think I've realized something about our conversation. It seems to me that you, Rebecca, and Don, perhaps, and others think that because we do effectively argue about moral issues, and we can bring reason to bear in talking to people, that shows that somehow or other there is a logical or rational way of deciding between moral values, between, say, loyalty and justice or whatever. And I think it's really something else, that a lot of people have not thought through what they think about their own moral basis for action. And you can even change their behavior by showing them what is at the bottom of their own moral judgments. I don't think you can change them, but you can expose them. Let me give an example, which I was thinking of before in connection with abortion. People say, and this is a nice moral postulate, you can't commit abortion because human life is sacred. Okay, you mean a fertilized egg is a human life that is sacred? Yes, a fertilized egg is alive. Well, a fertilized egg has no consciousness. I mean, you can have this conversation, I'm imagining it. A fertilized egg has no consciousness, has no desire to live, has no feeling of pain. I mean, it doesn't have a nervous system. So what's so hot about it? Why is it so special? Well, at that point, the conversation divides. The person you're talking to may say, fertilized egg is alive, human life is sacred, that's the end of the story. I don't think you can argue that any further. I mean, if they really take that position, you've really reached the end of logical discussion. On the other hand, they may say, well, I think a fertilized egg is special because it'll grow up into a conscious being who can enjoy life. And then you say, well, perhaps, what about a sperm that's about to enter an egg? That also, if not interfered with, would grow up into a human being. Yes, I take your point. I'm against contraception also. Well, what about chastity? Chastity means that you will not produce human beings that you otherwise
I'm in
might
favor
have.
of chastity.
What?
They always say they're in favor of chastity,
and they
but
say,
the whole thing is against just
no,
about being
I mean,
sex.
I think the Mormons originally were against chastity because it interfered with the production of human souls. But the Catholics have never been against chastity. And, at this point, you may get some reflection of the person that their own moral views are incoherent and they are not sure how their judgments really work. But only if there is that kind of incoherence, you might bring it out and bring some coherence to it. But if they've said a human egg is a living thing and it is sacred and it must not be interfered with, I don't see how you can argue that.
Well, you don't even try. You let time pass, and then you find that people gradually change their minds by all sorts of subtle forces.
But they're not rational arguments.
Yeah, I think I have a way of articulating your concern, Steve. Tell me if I'm right. We go off to another planet. We send our anthropologists to another planet, and they're very, very different from us. And we study them, but they've got civilization, and they've gone through the process, and they've chosen their best practices, and they've moralized them and all that. And we see what their morality is, and we can explain why they think this is right, and what their morality is. We see how it grows. So we've done the natural history. We've done all the factual scientific investigation of this phenomenon that we can. And Steve would say, and I would agree, right. And now the question is, do we honor it? Just because this planet, they've done it. The question now, should we, when in Rome, when we go there, should we honor their morality? And that's an open question. We haven't even addressed that question yet. And if Steve is saying there's no premise from our whole scientific study of this planet which tells us if we visit and we don't honor their morality, we are morally wrong. We're imprudent, to say the least, and we're being very, very undiplomatic. But I think it's true that there is no proof that we ought to honor their morality.
Yeah. I mean, this came up in the period before the Civil War. It was frequently argued that by the Southerners that they have a culture which is different from ours, ours meaning the North, and we, the people in the North, should honor their way of judging things, just as they are prepared to honor the Northern dislike of slavery. And, well, in fact, they went further than that. They said the Northerners oppress their workers. They don't provide for them when they're old, and they're wage slaves, essentially. But, in fact, I see no moral necessity, because I doubt the rationality of moral judgments. That doesn't lead me to a moral judgment that we ought to honor other civilizations. And today, I mean, really, do we want to honor a society's moral judgments when they practice honor killing or execute apostates?
What I was going to add was, when we look at this other planet.
And the other planet is here on Earth.
Well, yes, all right, but I'm deliberately making a bit of a remove here. It is certainly wide open to us to look at how far they've come and decide that, in a certain sense, by their own lights, given their own natures, they're still in the dark. They are still, in their own terms, they are morally primitive, they are morally obtuse, and we could even think that we owed them our attempt to show them a better way of doing things. And that's what we can do on Earth as well. We can go to a place that has honor killing and say, look, this isn't just cultural imperialism. We think that we can reason you out of...
How would you reason people out of honor killings? I mean, you would tell them it leads to unhappiness, it leads to all kinds of things that you regard as bad, and they would say, but it safeguards our honor. Honor is a value which is transcendently more important than happiness. What are you going to say to them? How are you going to what kind of reason can you give them?
We have done that throughout the history of our own Western society, right? We had that kind of stuff, and we reasoned ourselves slowly. Unfortunately, it's painful. It takes generations for persuasion. It doesn't happen immediately.
Yes, but Steve's point is that though we have moved our morality from one place to another, a place which we now prefer, that doesn't substantiate the claim that we have come closer to the truth.
But there is I thought that we agree pretty much. There is no such thing as the truth with the capital T when we're talking about these things. There are ways of doing things that are better or worse for human beings. That's what we mean by better or worse in a moral sense, right?
That's consequentialist then. I mean, you're sort of running into Sam Harris's view. And I wanted
No. First of all, consequentialism isn't Sam Harris' view. It's John Stuart Mill's view. No. I'm just.
But so give me a sec. So isn't there a puzzle here? I agree with Rebecca and with Dan, and I think many of the people in the room who say we've gotten better, right?
In order to be no better, nobody's.
Well, okay, that's great. So this is the puzzle, right? So animals get better. Horses are better than sponges. We have, and that.
What?
Sorry. Just to say, horses have greater Kolmogorov complexity than sponges.
That's right. Better Kolmogorov complexity.
We see an increase in the complexity of the biosphere. I'll put it in more abstract terms. I like horses.
That's not the point.
And we think we need a theory to explain why this happens, right? We need a theory to explain why birds get better at flying, all sorts of things. And we have a theory for this, theory of evolution. Science is better than it was 100 years ago. Okay, we don't have a super theory of scientific methodology, but we have a sense, we do experiments, we're in contact with nature, and presumably that explains why we've gotten better scientifically. We need a theory for why organisms get better and more adapted to their environment. We don't. It seems like we're all... Steve's example of arguing with someone who's against abortion, this is absolutely, or Don's example of his family that sort of wildly gets better morally. Don't we need an explanation for that?
But I think we have an explanation, okay. And some of it is game theory, right? We can really do some of the detail work, right? So let's take another case.
Don, can I ask you, because I would love to hear this, but we really should have coffee time, and I think we should continue this conversation, and you'd be a great place to start that.